I was picking up a prescription at the Shoppers Drug Mart on Carling Avenue when my son called. His voice was steady, the way it gets when he's trying not to fall apart. He said my daughter-in-law was in the emergency room at the Civic. He said she'd been asking for me. I left my prescription on the counter. The drive from Nepean took 22 minutes, but it felt like 2 hours. I kept telling myself it was probably nothing serious. A fall, maybe. Stress. She was 7 months along, and she'd been working too hard. I told myself that the whole way there, gripping the steering wheel with both hands while the February sleet hit the windshield. When I found her, she was in a curtained bay in the ER, her face turned toward the wall. There was a bruise along her left cheekbone, the color of a plum. Her lip was split. Her right wrist was wrapped in a tensor bandage. I stood in the doorway for a moment before she heard me and turned, and when she saw it was me, she started to cry, the way people cry when they've been holding it in for a very long time. I sat beside her bed and took her unwrapped hand in both of mine. I didn't say anything right away. Sometimes you don't need to. After a while, she said quietly, almost without sound. She told them I brought it on myself. She said a woman like me was always going to end up here. I felt something go cold in my chest. A woman like you, I repeated. She nodded, just barely, and she told me everything. My daughter-in-law's name is Amara. She came to Canada from Nigeria when she was 19 on a student visa, and she earned her nursing degree at Algonquin, and she met my son Liam at a St. Dean Patrick's Day party in the Glebe when they were both 24, and I have loved her from the first Sunday she sat at my kitchen table and helped me peel potatoes without being asked. She didn't make a performance of it. She just picked up a peeler and started talking. That told me everything I needed to know. They married 4 years later in a small ceremony at a conservation area in the Gatineau Hills. Just family and close friends. Amara wore her mother's gold earrings, and Liam cried during the vows, and I cried too, and I didn't bother pretending I wasn't. Liam's father and I divorced when Liam was 9. It was one of those divorces that nobody fights about anymore, because by the time the papers are signed, you've both already grieved the marriage 100 times over. We stayed civil. We stayed reasonable. For Liam's sake, we showed up to the same rooms and sat on opposite sides and behaved like adults. His father remarried 8 years later, a woman named Constance. I want to be careful about how I describe Constance, because I spent many years trying to be fair. I told myself that she loved Liam in her way. I told myself that her stiffness around Amara was just shyness or discomfort with people she didn't know well, or the particular awkwardness of a stepmother who came into a child's life too late to be a real mother but too early to be invisible. I told myself that for 4 years. I stopped telling myself that on the night Amara ended up in the Civic ER with a split lip and a sprained wrist and a bruise the color of a plum. What happened started, as these things often do, with money. Liam's father had a life insurance policy that named Liam as a secondary beneficiary. When he passed, a heart attack, sudden, in November, 3 years into Liam and Amara's marriage, the policy paid out. It wasn't a fortune, about $62,000, but it was something, enough to matter. Constance contested it. She said Liam's father had intended to update the policy before he died and simply hadn't gotten around to it. She hired a lawyer in Kanata. The case dragged on for months. In the end, Liam received his share, just under $31,000. But Constance never forgave him for it, or for being his father's son when she'd wanted his father entirely for herself. After that, her coolness toward Amara became something sharper. She started making small comments at family dinners about Amara's cooking being interesting, about how exhausting it must be to keep 2 cultural identities going at once. Once, at a birthday party for one of Constance's grandchildren from her first marriage, she introduced Amara to a neighbor as Liam's wife. She's from Africa, with a particular emphasis on Africa, that made the neighbor glance at her sideways. Amara told me about that 1 month later, almost casually, the way you mentioned something you've decided not to be wounded by. I should have said something then, louder than I did. The pregnancy changed things. Or rather, it gave Constance something new to work with. She started showing up unannounced at Liam and Amara's townhouse in Barhaven. She would bring things, a casserole, a bag of baby clothes from Value Village that she'd washed but not folded, and she would walk through the rooms with that particular way she had of looking at everything without looking directly at anything. She told Amar that she'd read that stress was very bad for mixed-race pregnancies. She said she'd read it in a magazine. There was no such article. Amara knew it, and I knew it, and I think even Liam knew it, but he'd spent his whole childhood learning to let the things Constance said slide past him, and that habit was hard to break. The night it happened, Liam was in Toronto for work, a 2-day conference. He works in federal procurement, and there was a supplier meeting he couldn't reschedule. Amara was alone. She'd come home from a shift at the Queensway Carlton, tired, 7 months pregnant, feet swollen. She told me she was just going to eat some leftover dal and go to bed early. Constance arrived at 8:15. She'd let herself in with a key Liam had given her 2 years earlier for emergencies. Amara had never asked him to take it back because she hadn't wanted to seem unreasonable. She didn't want to seem unreasonable. I think about that a lot. What followed, Amara told me in pieces over several days because she could only get through a little of it at a time. There was an argument. Constance said things about the baby, about what kind of life a child with Amara's background would have, about whether Liam truly understood what he'd signed up for, about stains that couldn't be washed out. Those were her words, stains that couldn't be washed out. Amara asked her to leave. Constance didn't leave. She took a step forward instead. I don't know exactly what happened in the next few minutes. Amara doesn't describe it in detail, and I've never pushed. What I know is that Amara fell, whether she was pushed or stumbled trying to back away, and her wrist hit the edge of the kitchen counter, and her face caught the corner of the cabinet door that was standing open. By the time she got herself up off the floor, Constance was already in the doorway with her coat on, saying that Amara should be more careful in her condition. That was what she said. Be more careful in your condition. Then she left. Amara lay on the kitchen floor for a while. She said the tile was cold and she could feel the baby moving, and she thought very clearly that she needed to get up. She called a cab on her phone because she didn't think she could drive. The cab took her to the Civic. That was when she called Liam. He called me 3 minutes later. I stayed with Amara that night. The baby was monitored and was fine, strong heartbeat, the nurse said, and I almost laughed with relief right there in the curtained bay. Amara's wrist wasn't fractured. The cut on her lip didn't need stitches. The bruise on her cheekbone was going to be there for a while. I called Liam from the waiting room while Amara was being assessed. I told him what she'd told me. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. He said, "I need to call you back." I said, "Liam." He said, "I know, Mom." "I know. Give me 20 minutes. He called back in 12. His voice was different. Quieter and steadier both at once, the way a person sounds when they've made a decision they know they'll have to live with. He said he was driving back tonight. He said he'd already called his lawyer, a colleague from work who specialized in family law. He said he was not going to let this go. I believed him. While I waited, I sat in a plastic chair in the ER, and I thought about all the times I had tried to be fair. All the times I had said, well, she means well, or she comes from a different generation, or Liam needs to manage his own relationships, or it isn't my place. I am 63 years old, and I have given a great deal of energy in my life to not overstepping, to being the reasonable one. I thought about Amara on the kitchen floor. I thought about her calling a cab by herself in the dark. I thought, enough. I have a brother. His name is Alastair, and he is 68, and he spent 30 years as a Crown attorney in Ottawa before he retired. He is not a man who makes speeches. He is a man who asks questions in a very quiet voice and then waits, and when people look at his face while he's waiting, they tend to answer honestly. I called him from the parking lot at 11:30 that night. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "Has anyone filed a police report?" I said, "Not yet." He said, "They should. Tonight, if possible, tomorrow morning at the latest. The injuries need to be documented while they're fresh." A pause. "I can make a call to someone I know at the division on Greenfield. Not to interfere, just so the right person gets assigned." I said, "Is that allowed?" He said, "I'm not asking them to do anything improper. I'm asking them to take it seriously." Another pause. "There's a difference, Irene." That was the moment I felt something loosen in my chest. Not because I thought Alistair was going to fix everything. I knew it wasn't that simple. But because I wasn't alone in the parking lot anymore. Because someone else was angry about the right things. Amara filed the report the next morning. Liam was with her. The officer who took the statement was thorough and kind, and she explained the process clearly. What would be documented, what the Crown's office would consider, what the timeline looked like. Amara answered every question. She didn't minimize anything. That took courage. I want to name clearly because it would have been so easy to say it was an accident, to say she didn't want trouble, to say the baby was fine, so maybe it wasn't worth pursuing. She didn't say any of those things. Constance's lawyer sent a letter 2 weeks later suggesting the incident had been mischaracterized. The letter described Constance as having been concerned about her stepson's wife's well-being and suggested that Amara, in a state of late pregnancy emotional distress, had misremembered the sequence of events. I read that letter sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold beside me, and I felt something I haven't felt since I was much younger. A pure, clean fury without any of the qualifications I usually wrap around my anger. Alistair's contact to the division had ensured the report was flagged appropriately, but what changed the case was something none of us had thought of. Amara's neighbour across the hall, a retired schoolteacher named Bev, who has lived in that building for 14 years, had been coming back from her evening walk when she heard raised voices from inside the townhouse. She'd stood in the hallway for a moment, uncertain. Then she'd gone back to her own unit and written down the time and what she'd heard in a small notebook she keeps by her door, because she is exactly the kind of woman who keeps a small notebook by her door. The Crown's office found her through the building's tenant list. Bev was 81 years old and had a memory like a filing cabinet and zero interest in being intimidated. She gave her statement clearly and without embellishment, and with the particular authority of someone who taught grade 5 for 38 years and has heard every possible excuse. Constance was charged with assault causing bodily harm. Given the pregnancy, the Crown pushed for conditions including no contact with Amara or Liam pending trial. The conditions were granted. In the months that followed, I learned things about Constance that I hadn't known. Liam had always told me, in the vague way adult children describe the other side of their family, that Constance was just difficult. What I learned, as the legal process moved forward, was that there had been a previous incident, not with Amara, but with the daughter of Constance's first husband, years earlier. That incident had not resulted in charges. It had resulted in a family meeting and a lot of careful language about stress and misunderstandings and moving forward. I thought about moving forward, about how much damage gets done in the name of moving forward. Amara's mother came from Lagos for the last 6 weeks of the pregnancy. Her name was Yetunde, and she was 66, and she arrived at the Ottawa airport in January with 2 enormous suitcases and a cooler packed with dried ingredients that she said she needed because you couldn't find proper Iru at the Loblaws on Merivale. She was absolutely right. She took over Amara and Liam's kitchen with the authority of a woman who has raised 4 children and knows exactly what a pregnant daughter needs. And watching her and Amara together in that kitchen, laughing at something, lowering the heat under a pot, arguing gently about the right way to cut the onions, I felt something settle in me that I hadn't realized was unsettled. The baby was born on a Tuesday in March, a girl. They named her Sawers Sawers for Liam's Irish grandmother, Adiaze for Amara's. 7 pounds, 2 ounces, the strongest cry I've ever heard from a newborn, like she came into the world with something to say. I held her 20 minutes after she was born, and I thought about everything that had tried to keep her from existing in this form, with these 2 families, with this name that held 2 languages at once. I thought about Constance saying stains that couldn't be washed out. I looked at Sarah Seadiza's face, and I thought, there is nothing here that needs washing out. There is nothing here that is anything other than exactly what it should be. Constance's case went to trial 9 months later. She was convicted of assault causing bodily harm. The judge noted in her decision that the presence of an unborn child at the time of the assault was an aggravating factor. She also noted Constance's failure to take responsibility at any point in the process, which the court found troubling. Constance was sentenced to 12 months of conditional sentence to be served in the community, along with mandatory counseling and 2 years of probation. There were those I know who thought she should have received more. I understood that feeling. I also knew that Amara had been through enough, and that a drawn-out appeal would have meant more years of living inside the case. And that sometimes the most important thing is not maximum punishment, but the acknowledgement, official, documented, irrevocable, that what happened was wrong. The court said, what you did was wrong. Constance had spent 4 years, implying that Amara was a stain. The court said, you are the one who caused harm here. That mattered. That will always matter. Liam had the lock on their townhouse changed the day the no-contact order was granted. He wrote his stepmother a letter, short, careful, final, and he never sent it. He showed it to me once. I told him he didn't need to send it. I told him the not sending was its own kind of closure. He thought about that for a moment, and then he nodded. Sazia's 14 months old now. She has Liam's nose and Amara's eyes and Yetundi's particular expression of dignified skepticism when confronted with something she finds unconvincing, a skill she apparently developed early. Amara went back to work at the Queensway Carlton when Sawasi was 10 months old. She comes for Sunday dinner most weeks. She helps me peel potatoes without being asked, same as she always has. We don't talk about the case every Sunday. Some Sundays we talk about the garden, or about Yetundi's WhatsApp messages, or about the show Amara and Liam are watching, or about Sauce's new tooth. But sometimes, when we're standing at the counter and it's quiet, and Liam is in the other room with the baby, Amara will say something that makes me understand how much she's still carrying. Not in a broken way, in the way that people carry things they've survived, with full knowledge of the weight, and with the decision made daily to keep going anyway. I think about what she said in the hospital. A woman like me was always going to end up here. Constance was wrong about everything. She was wrong about the blood, wrong about the stain, wrong about the ending she thought she was writing for my family. But she was right about one thing, without meaning to be. A woman like Amara does always end up somewhere. She ends up standing at my kitchen counter on a Sunday afternoon, passing me a bowl of potato peels, telling me about her daughter's new tooth. She ends up exactly where she belongs. And the people who tried to take that from her ended up somewhere too. I keep coming back to the key, not the court date, not the verdict, not even the moment Amara filed the report. The key. The one Liam gave Constance for emergencies, the one Amara never asked to be taken back because she didn't want to seem unreasonable. That's the detail that stays with me at 2 a.m. when I can't sleep. How much damage we allow because we're trying to be fair. How much we absorb because we've been taught that keeping the peace is a virtue, when sometimes keeping the peace just means letting someone else break things quietly. I fought a lot about what allowed Constance to do what she did. Not just the hatred. Hatred alone doesn't walk through a door uninvited. What allowed it was years of small permissions, a comment let slide at a dinner table, a look not called out, a key not taken back. Every time someone chose not to say anything, Constance learned something. She learned that the cost of cruelty in this family was very low. That's how it works, I think. Not with one dramatic moment, but with 100 small ones where we each decide whether we're going to hold the line or move it. Constance moved the line so many times that she stopped believing there was one. And then she discovered there was. What I'm most proud of, not of myself, but of this whole painful chapter, is that Amara didn't collapse it into silence. She could have. The cab ride to the hospital alone, in the dark, 7 months pregnant, not calling anyone until she absolutely had to. That tells you everything about how much she'd learned to manage on her own. She'd been managing for years, but she didn't manage this one into disappearing. She sat in that hospital bed and she told me the truth, and then she told it again to a police officer, and then she told it in a written statement, and she kept telling it until it was on record somewhere that couldn't be erased. That's what I think of when I hear the word courage. Not the dramatic kind, the kind that means telling the truth when it would be so much easier and so much more familiar to absorb the harm and carry on. Alistair asked the right questions because he spent his life understanding that justice doesn't happen by accident. It happens because someone knows the system well enough to navigate it and cares enough to bother. He used his knowledge not to pull strings, but to make sure the right people took it seriously. That's what knowledge is actually for, not to protect yourself from consequences, but to make sure the right things have them. And say, 14 months old and already skeptical of everything she finds unconvincing, she exists because her mother didn't let shame win. She'll grow up not knowing most of this, but she'll grow up in a family where the adults, when it mattered, did not look away. I hope she inherits that. I hope it goes into her the way things do when children are too young to be told, but old enough to absorb. Constance called Amara a stain. I held Sauza in the delivery room 20 minutes after she was born, and I thought, this is what the world looks like when it goes right. This child, with her 2 names and her 2 grandmothers and her father's nose and her father's nose and her mother's eyes. There is nothing here that is a stain. There is nothing here that is anything other than whole. And Constance ended up exactly where people end up when they spend their lives trying to diminish others. Alone and finally accountable